¿Listos?
Le dejo la palabra al arquitecto Cabrera. Buen día.
Bueno, muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Bienvenidos a esta videoconferencia donde vamos a tener el gusto y el honor de escuchar a Liza Goldberg. La conferencia, como fue anunciado, será en inglés. Vamos a hacer el switch ahora al idioma inglés y nos va a acompañar también nuestro buen amigo Leandro, quien va a hacer la introducción de Liza. Welcome everyone to this video conference promoting the space science in young people in Central America. We want to say hello at the name of our Secretary General Vinicio Cerezo, the Secretary of the Central American System of Integration. Welcome everyone, and I give you the very best welcome to our friend Liza, who's gonna share with us his experience in space uses of the technology and information. I'm gonna give the floor now to our good friend Leo. Please, Leo, go ahead.
Thank you, Jorge and Sika, for the invitation, and hi to everyone that is connected to this live stream session and to anyone that is watching this video later. For this edition of Sika in Space, it's an honor to have today the young leader and scientist Liza Goldberg. She is an Earth System Science Interdisciplinary Center scientist and also a NASA student research assistant that was awarded with the Young Explorer Grant 2020 by National Geographic. With this grant, Liza is launching Cloud to Classroom, an innovative project that uses satellite imagery to help K-12 classroom students understand global environmental change through remote sensing. So help us giving the welcome to Liza. Welcome, Liza.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be with all of you today, and I'm excited to share with you my experiences in remote sensing and specifically highlight some cloud-based remote sensing tools that anyone in the world can use free of cost to start introducing remote sensing into your own research. So I will start by sharing my screen. Okay, so like was mentioned, my name is Liza Goldberg. I'm a student researcher at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, which is just north of Washington, D.C. in the United States. And I'm also a first-year student at Stanford University in California. So just to go over a quick overview of what I'll be speaking about today, I wanted to start out with discussing the origins of the Geo for Good program at Google, which encompasses Google Earth Engine and several other Google Earth related tools that I'll be going over the course of this presentation. So from there, I'll start by giving a general introduction to Google Earth Engine, which is the main technology that I'll be talking about today. And then from there, if we have time, I would like to go into a couple other Google-oriented tools that you can combine with Google Earth Engine to get a better understanding of using satellites for environmental change. So without further ado, today I would actually like to begin with a story in the Brazilian rainforest. So this is Chief Almir of the Surui people, which is a really unique indigenous tribe who resides in the heart of the Amazon rainforest. And this tribe actually had no contact with the outside world until around 1969. And unfortunately, during the year 1969, the transnational railroad and highway system began construction throughout the heart of the Amazon. And with the construction of that highway system, there started to be a lot more deforestation in the region because of increased demand for logging and increased access to the forests. So since that year, much of the rainforest around the Surui territory has been destroyed for logging purposes. And since the Surui have lived in this region for generations, The destruction of their forests also means the destruction of their livelihood and culture. And the problem here was that since this tribe was so isolated from the outside world, Chief Almir and the Surui people really had no effective way to either measure the scope of the deforestation that was occurring or communicate what was actually happening here to the outside world. Until actually in an internet cafe in 2007, Chief Almir was able to look at Google Earth and see the deforestation that was occurring around his territory from a new perspective. So here you can see in this Google Earth image here, in this red polygon here, this is the extent of the Surui territory, and you can see how sort of cut off it is from the rest of the agricultural development in Brazil. But more importantly, you can see these sorts of lines of agricultural encroachment that are sort of gradually encroaching into the Surui territory here. So this is the deforestation that I was speaking about before. So using these Google Earth images, Chief Almir was actually able to see the perspective of his territory from space. And ultimately, he was able to reach out to members of Google's Earth team and travel to Google headquarters to see what he could possibly do about it. So in 2007, he was able to meet with Rebecca Moore, who is the head of the Google Earth Outreach Program, who also agreed that Google Earth could potentially be a means of using satellite imagery to tell the story of the Surui people. And what they did, the whole Google Earth and Earth Engine teams were actually able to travel to Brazil to meet with the Surui tribe and Chief Almir to actually train the tribe in terms of using Google Earth to monitor the environmental disturbance that was occurring in their region. And ultimately, the result was really incredible. The Surui people were able to document different local locations where they had different traditions and aspects of their cultural heritage on Google Earth. And what they were also able to do is actually start uploading photos and videos of the illegal deforestation and logging that was occurring to Google Earth to update the authorities when these activities were occurring. What they were also able to do, and I'll get into this a little bit more later, is use Google Earth Engine to document the amount of carbon that was being released through the logging and deforestation efforts. And because of that documentation of the carbon that was being released, they were able to receive money for their carbon offsets from the international carbon marketplace. And so ultimately, using this one example as a base, the Google team is now currently working with dozens of indigenous groups throughout the Amazon and across the world in terms of using satellite imagery to help preserve cultures and resources, as well as stop continued environmental disturbance through deforestation. But ultimately, satellite technology doesn't have to just be used to measure deforestation. It can really be a means of measuring and analyzing environmental change in all aspects across the world. So for example, here, and you can see in this video, in Dubai, in the UAE, encroaching urbanization as it expands into a neighboring water body over time. You can see this result over decades worth of imagery. In another example, you can see this particular mine in Chile as it expands across the landscape, and you can see the environmental disturbance across the terrain that occurs. And then finally, as a third example, you can see in Great Salt Lake in Utah in the United States, as the lake actually shrinks over time. This is due to overuse of water resources throughout the Midwestern United States for agriculture. So as you can see from these examples, satellite imagery can really be an effective means of essentially seeing a bird's eye view of changes that we're seeing across Earth. So now the question becomes, how do we actually get access to these satellite images? And at least part of the answer to that is a tool called Google Earth Engine. Which is, if you're familiar with Google Earth, you can think of Google Earth Engine as essentially the back end of that program there. It's a planetary scale platform for Earth science data and analysis at the global scale, powered by Google's cloud. So Earth Engine has essentially four parts. The first is a really robust data catalog of various aspects of satellite-based data sets. some of which I'll get to a little bit later, including things like climate data, land cover data, things like radar and multispectral data. And essentially how Google Earth Engine works is they're able to create contracts with different space companies and universities across the world, and then store all of that data on Google's storage machines and laptops out in Mountain View, California. And then whenever any researcher across the world is interested in accessing that data, they're able to essentially call up the servers on California and say, okay, I want access to this particular data set. And within seconds, they're able to actually access that data. And so that series of calls that they have to make to the Google servers is made through the JavaScript programming interface. So using JavaScript coding, people are actually able to process that satellite data on the fly in the cloud. And I'll get into, if you're a Python user, how you can potentially start using Earth Engine in Python as well. And the really great thing about Earth Engine is that all of this programming can actually just be done in your web browser, just on a website. All you need is a modest internet connection, no downloads necessary, no costs necessary. So the amazing thing about Earth Engine is that they've purposely made it extremely accessible so that anyone in the world, as long as you have an internet connection, can start accessing these data. So I mentioned the Google Earth Engine data catalog here. Here you can see in this animation as the computer scrolls through all of these different kinds of data that you're able to access. You're able to see things like Landsat 1 through 8 data. Landsat, if you're not familiar with the program, is a NASA and United States Geological Survey program to basically document environmental change since 1972 all the way up to the present day. So Earth Engine actually has all of that data that you're able to access at your leisure. Earth Engine also has a variety of kinds of temperature data. So we're able to go back as far as the year 1950 to see how Earth's land surface temperature and sea surface temperature has changed over time. And then also evaluate those trends to see how they'll change far into the future with climate change. Earth Engine actually recently just introduced a new program of high resolution imagery. So you're able to actually see imagery up to the 1 to 3 meter resolution. So really getting into some high depth analyses of environmental change on the hyperlocal level. Earth Engine also has a range of terrain data, so things like looking at water bodies and mountains over time as we cross the world. You can see that both in your local community and other hotspot regions. So basically the idea here is pretty simple. You're able to access these different satellite imagery data sets. You apply your own algorithms to that data in using JavaScript or Python. And then using those algorithms, you're able to have real world impact in your local community or across the world. So just to introduce a couple of these real world applications in terms of how Earth Engine has been used in the past. One of the most well-known applications of Google Earth Engine is a program called Global Forest Watch, which was the first main application of Earth Engine technology. So using the Landsat satellite data that I spoke about before, using Earth Engine, a team of researchers out of University of Maryland and several other institutions were able to map the extent of all forest cover gain and forest cover loss over the past 2 decades. And these data were actually ultimately used as a major turning point in the whole field of remote sensing, because now researchers are actually able to understand how different forests and ecosystems are changing in real time across the world. And you can access this application at globalforestwatch.org. Another really interesting recent application of Earth Engine has been something called Global Fishing Watch. So you can see in all of these blue dots here, these are current boats and oceanic vessels across the world. So using Earth Engine and radar data, scientists were actually able to track the extent of all boat movement, including illegal fishing across the world, in order to increase transparency and allow governments to track their fishing sector over time. And you can see that goes all the way back to the year 2000. Another really interesting application of Earth Engine has been an analysis of all global surface water change. So a couple of the examples I showed you at the beginning showed how lakes are shrinking or growing over time using satellite imagery. So using Earth Engine, researchers were able to document the extent of droughts over the last 2 decades and how those different weather patterns and changes in seasonality are impacting the extent of water in different lakes and oceans over time. And as with the Global Forest Watch data, you're able to access this data set at the link at the bottom here, globalsurfacewater.appspot.com. And then finally, there are dozens of examples of more regional applications of Earth Engine. This particular app shows a land use decision support system in Rwanda in Africa. And so working with local communities, researchers were able to document the extent of various kinds of infrastructure like schools, hospitals. You can see a road network here and how that might be relevant to the humanitarian interests of local populations. So how are these applications actually built? So this is the Earth Engine programming interface here. This is how you're actually able to get access to the data and start processing it. And there are 4 main components of the Earth Engine interface. So the first you can see at the top here, you can essentially search for any data set you want in this top bar here. So that's where you would access things like the Landsat data or the temperature data that I spoke about before. And this main portion here, where you see the code, this is where you're actually able to process the data in JavaScript. And then you can do things like printing various aspects of the data on the right here to start inspecting the data sets. You're also able to actually visualize the satellite data here. This image actually happens to be a global nightlights image that shows it's basically a proxy for population or urbanization over time. So you can see, especially throughout Europe, all of these cities in these bright colors. Analyze using satellite imagery. And then finally, what you're also able to do is simply save your codes. You can think of this part of the Earth Engine interface as like a file folder. And what's really unique about Earth Engine is you're actually able to also import your own personal data sets. So if you have field data that you collected, you're able to import it into Earth Engine and then process it in JavaScript like you would any normal data set in the collection. And I know for those who aren't necessarily familiar with coding, the idea of processing the satellite data in JavaScript might seem really intimidating. But the good thing is Earth Engine is really amazing because it has dozens and dozens of pages of sample codes and resources that you're able to access very easily. And so the learning curve actually is not very significant at all when we're thinking of actually getting started with analyzing these data. And I'll link to those resources a little bit later. What you're also able to do in Earth Engine once you've actually finished your satellite imagery analyses is try to actually share that analysis with the world. And so Earth Engine recently launched an apps program where anyone can create a live website or mobile app that can show the world and the broader scientific community the results of your scientific analysis. And you can actually share those results with anyone in the world without them having an Earth Engine account. And so if you're interested in checking out some sample Earth Engine apps, this URL right here, if you access it, will actually show you a gallery of some sample apps that the Earth Engine team has put together in terms of some different alternatives for sharing your analyses. So before I continue on with Earth Engine in particular, I wanted to talk a little bit about a project that I recently started that builds off of this capacity to build these apps. So over the past year or so, I've been working on a project that we're actually now calling Space Scope. I know in the intro it mentioned Cloud to Classroom, but we recently decided to change the name to Space Scope. And the idea with this project here is that we want to build a series of apps, like I showed you before, to essentially communicate various aspects of climate change and global environmental change to students and the broader public across the world. As I spoke about before at the beginning of this presentation, satellite imagery can be a really interesting means of communicating environmental change in a way that just statistics or news articles can't. And so using these apps, we're looking to improve the way that students across the world actually understands how they're impacting the Earth across the world. And so we're developing a list of dozens of applications. These are some main focus areas that we've been developing in lately. And these applications range from sea surface temperature apps that allow people to do things like clicking on particular spots in oceans and seeing how the temperature has changed over time. We also have things like urbanization apps, ice melt, drought, plus definitely more in development. And so you're actually able to access some very early versions of the app on a beta version of the website at www.spacescope.app. So just to go over a couple of different examples of these apps that we're talking about, this particular app is showing global human influence over time. So you're able to track how humans have cumulatively impacted various aspects of their local communities through tracking things like population density, urban expansion, agricultural extent, and then put all of those data together to click on any country in the world and analyze how that country has been impacted by human influence over time. In this next app, you're seeing the extent of Amazon fires over the last several years and how those data overlap with the extent of deforestation throughout the Amazon. So looking at relationships between multiple environmental variables to try and get at how these regional scale trends are impacting different ecosystems. And in this last demo here, we have several before and after apps where, for example, this app focuses on Earth's land use and water supply. And you can see the change before and after in the Aral Sea's extent in the Middle East as it shrinks due to climate change. And just a couple other quick sort of hotspot apps. We have this global ice melt app where you're able to actually zoom into a couple of different hotspots. This particular hotspot is in Greenland to see how ice melt and global ice extent has changed over time. We also have Urban Explorer apps that allow students and users of the apps to analyze how different cities and populations are changing over time. This particular image is in Shanghai, China, and you can see obviously the extreme access to urban regions and growth of urban expansion over time. And then finally, we also have some hyper-regional examples. This particular app showing the early 2020 Brazilian floods and mudslides that occurred due to extreme events in these different regions. You can see using radar imagery before and after. So as I mentioned before, we're continuing to develop these apps. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but if any of you are actually interested in joining the SpaceScope team and starting to collaborate on future app development, I do have a couple opportunities that I'll speak about at the end of this presentation. And this is the link to a couple, these links here all link to various apps that we've been working on over the last 6 months or so for you to check out. So moving on with Google Earth Engine in terms of other applications that you're able to actually pursue. One of the main benefits of Earth Engine, as I mentioned before, is that you're actually able to import your own field data that you collected in your local communities to the Earth Engine interface to analyze on the fly. And one of the best ways of doing that is using something called Open Data Collect, which is a field app that you're able to use that I won't necessarily be going into today, but it essentially allows you to collect your own pictures or numerical data, and then you can actually upload that data to a website called Open Data Kit Aggregate, and then actually export that data as a CSV, and then just import the CSV directly into Google Earth Engine, which is actually a really new, exciting feature of the Earth Engine interface. And once that CSV is imported into Earth Engine, then you're able to analyze it just like you would any other data set in the catalog. So the next few slides, I do want to talk a little bit about alternatives to Earth Engine, to the JavaScript interface. If anyone in the audience is interested primarily in coding in Python. If you're not, this is only a couple slides, so just bear with me. So there are three main options for coding in Python and Google Earth Engine. The first would be if you use something called a Conda install. So if you're interested in using Conda for Google Earth Engine, this is best if you want to just code locally on your computer if you don't have an internet connection, for example. But I would say the Conda interface is fairly limited in terms of the new algorithms that you're able to work with in Earth Engine. The second option is using something called Google Colab, which is a cloud-based option for coding in Python. If you're familiar with Google Drive or Google Docs, for example, Google Colab you can think of as pretty similar, except it's just for coding instead of writing papers, for example. And so this Google Colab is probably the easiest to get started, and it's basically a hosted notebook environment in which you can just really easily install the Google Earth Engine programming interface and start coding in Python. And then finally, the third option is something called Jupyter Labs, which is, you can basically think of Google Colab, but for your local computer. So again, you don't need an internet connection for this. And so this basically packages both the Google Earth Engine Python functionality with some other functions that you're able to find using the normal Jupyter Lab interface, like other scientific Python packages. So in terms of getting started with Earth Engine, if you're comparing all of these different options, in terms of ease of use, the Google Earth Engine code editor in JavaScript is by far the easiest to get started with. It's what I still use, actually, because I think it's the most intuitive and the quickest if you're looking at doing large-scale global analyses. Unfortunately, it does have essentially the lowest functionality if you're looking at developing super complex algorithms, especially when we go into machine learning, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But I would say for anyone just getting started with Earth Engine, the code editor in JavaScript is definitely the way to go, even if you are familiar with Python. The middle option here would be using Google Colab. So this is kind of intermediate in terms of how easy it is to get started, and both in terms of that and also in terms of functionality. So Google Colab might be a good option if you're really particular about using Python, or you're particularly interested in some machine learning applications that I spoke about later. And then finally, Jupyter Lab notebooks are definitely the hardest to use, but they have the greatest functionality when we're looking at developing super complex algorithms. But like I said, I definitely would recommend starting out with the code editor, if only because of the variety of resources that are also available in terms of sample codes to get started with remote sensing. And then the final sort of advanced Google Earth Engine topic that I want to cover here is how you can start doing some really simple machine learning analyses. So the field of remote sensing and satellite imagery analysis is increasingly using remote sensing as a means of really getting down to the local scale and improving how we're able to measure local deforestation and things like land cover and land use change. So just within the JavaScript code editor, you're able to run algorithms like random forest or support vector machine. If you're not familiar with these algorithms, don't worry about it at all. There are tons of sample codes in Google Earth Engine already that let you essentially run these algorithms without really even understanding how they work, which is, I suppose, both a good and bad thing. But it's just testament to say that the Earth Engine algorithms are really that accessible. And then, as I mentioned before, if you are interested in pursuing some of the more advanced aspects of the Earth Engine interface, using things like Jupyter notebooks or integration with TensorFlow, which is Google's machine learning network, then you can start doing things like deep neural networks, convolutional neural networks that really are able to analyze these satellite data in really revolutionary ways that we haven't seen before. So kind of just to finish up my discussion of Google Earth Engine and its applications, It's pretty common in Earth Engine, especially at the beginning, to get a really wide variety of different errors. But the good thing is there are, just in your coding, but the good thing is there are a lot of different resources, as I've mentioned before, to start kind of getting past those errors and developing complete analyses. So the first thing I would definitely suggest in getting started would be looking through the developer's guide that I list at the top here. So this is essentially a guide to all of the different functions that you're able to run in Google Earth Engine, as well as accessing all of the sample code that I spoke about before from past researchers around the world to try to apply them for your own analyses. I also put together a quick start Google Earth Engine repository. So once you're able to actually register for Earth Engine, you can simply click this link, and this presentation will be shared with you later. To start getting access to some, I would say, I think 5 or 6 different critical sample codes that I think are really necessary to get started in Earth Engine, just to start checking things out. I also definitely recommend reading through some sample slide decks from past Geo for Good and Google Earth Engine summits. Every year, the Google Earth team puts on a global scale conference where researchers from around the world are able to learn more about Earth Engine's functionality. But the good thing is a lot of the past summits have actually included all of their slide presentations that I think are really, really useful in terms of analyzing the different functionalities in Earth Engine. Fourth, I think checking out the Google Earth Engine developers group. If you're familiar with Google Groups, it's just a typical publicly available Google group where any Earth Engine developers across the world are able to access it. And the great thing about this group is that if you have any kind of error, first of all, you can usually just search it up, and chances are someone has had that error before you and can help you out. Or you can call up any of the Earth Engine developers using the Google group, and they can actually go into your code and fix it for you. And along those lines, typical methods of debugging like Stack Exchange, Earth Engine also has groups there where you're able to access that. Then finally, you're always welcome to email me. I'm more than happy to help anyone who has gotten stuck with Earth Engine and needs some assistance with that. And some final resources listed here in terms of actually signing up for Earth Engine. The Medium and YouTube pages I think are really recommended in terms of looking at sample projects that other scientists around the world have been using. So in this final part of this presentation here, I want to go a little bit beyond Google Earth Engine and look at some other Google Earth related tools that I think complements the Earth Engine interface really well. The first thing I'll be speaking about a little bit is time-lapse in the middle here, which is a long-term archive of all of the historical imagery in Earth Engine that you're able to easily access with no code. I'll also be talking a little bit about some new aspects of Google Earth, like Voyager and creation tools, where users are able to analyze pre-curated stories in terms of environmental change and also create their own. And then finally, if we have time, I'll go a little bit into Google Earth Studio, which is a new animation tool for creating videos using Google Earth satellite imagery. So first, as I mentioned, I want to start with time-lapse. So time-lapse is really great if you just want to get some sort of local examples of environmental changes that are really clear and don't necessarily want to go all the way into the Earth Engine interface and start analyzing the satellite imagery for yourself. So what Google has done is they've actually created singular images called composites of Landsat imagery over the last 35 years. And so using Google Earth time-lapse, you're able to actually go back all the way into the past and see over time how those locations have changed. And I also included this link here to the Carnegie Mellon University's Create Lab website, where you can actually create your own time-lapse video without any coding in terms of looking at these local hotspots. So just to kind of show what this looks like, this is the time-lapse interface. On the right here, in the middle, you're able to see an example of environmental change. In this case, this is the famous Columbia Glacier retreat in northern Alaska. And then, as you can see on the left, as I scroll down, And you can see, you can kind of scroll through all of these examples of environmental change. And now we're going halfway across the world, all the way to Brazil, where we're able to see the encroachment of agricultural development and urban development over time. And you're able to essentially look at your local community or also across the world. So the next tool I want to quickly go over is Google Earth Voyager. So Voyager you can think of as the front page of Google Earth. It's where other researchers around the world have created these visual stories of environmental change in various aspects of their local cultures. And these kind of collections of images can include things like guided tours using Google Earth imagery or street view imagery, even things like geography quizzes if they're meant for students, and other rich data visualizations. So just kind of as an example of one particular story here, this is actually one of my favorites called Tracking the Rainbird. And this particular Voyager story is able to track the distribution of this particular bird across North India, which has historically matched the onset of the Indian monsoon season, which is really interesting ecologically. So through this Voyager story, a user can actually go into some of these hotspots across India where this bird has been found and look in the Google Earth Street View imagery. I'm sure you're familiar with if you've ever used Google Maps and taken a picture, you're actually able to go in and see what this landscape looks like from the grounds. And these Voyager stories also provide access to things like wall-to-wall satellite images and models that you're able to export from Google Earth Engine. So on the left panel here, you're able to see the extent of the South Asian monsoon season over the last year or so. So each Voyager story is very different. This is just one particular example, but I definitely recommend just going to Google Earth. It's just google.com/earth, and then checking out some of the examples that they have. As kind of another quick example here, another Voyager story that is also, I think, one of the most interesting ones, focuses on sea level rise and how coastal cities around the world will be impacted. And so this is a project developed by the agency called Climate Central. And what they've done is actually go into cities across the world. Here you can see in London, and model how the city will look under scenarios of 4 degrees Celsius warming versus 2 degrees Celsius warming through climate change over time, and how that will impact cities. So this is kind of another example of how Voyager actually lets you go to more of the local scale and analyze, just using these different images, how environmental change will impact these hotspots over time. The third tool that I definitely want to mention, at least quickly, is the Google Environmental Insights Explorer. So this new tool was developed to basically help city governments across the world track the progression of urban emissions over time, as well as other locally relevant factors like tree cover. So through Environmental Insights Explorer, governments are actually able to go in to their local city and analyze things like air quality just on the local neighborhood level. Here you can see this is a particular Earth Engine app looking at London and how air quality has changed over time and changes on the road-to-road basis throughout the city. So if you're interested in any aspect of urban development and how cities are adapting and changing due to climate change over time, then I definitely recommend Environmental Insights Explorer as a means of getting really down to the local level. And then the final tool that I want to show here is something called Earth Studio that I think is really exciting because it actually lets you animate Google Earth's 3D and satellite imagery in order to create these really interactive videos on the local to the global scale. And any 3D imagery that you're able to access in Google Earth but not Earth Engine is actually accessible in Google Earth Studio as well. So just kind of an example of how Earth Studio can be used. I do want to show this quick video showcasing various things you're able to do on the animation side with Earth Studio's tools. Yeah, so that was, I think, a pretty incredible representation that the Google Earth team put together in terms of the extent of how you're able to actually use Google Earth Engine in creating these really amazing visualizations of your local cities and across the world. And with that, that was a complete whirlwind tour of all of the different Google suite of tools that you're able to integrate with Earth Engine, and all of the different means that you're able to use satellite imagery and monitoring local to global scale environmental change. And so just to finish up here, if you're interested in getting involved in developing these sorts of satellite-based tools through the Space Scope program that I spoke to you about before, we're actively looking for young researchers and scientists and students interested in application development in Google Earth Engine, satellite imagery analysis, if you're more interested in looking at the remote sensing backend of things and how we can actually use satellite imagery in conducting these analyses of environmental change. We're also definitely looking for people who are interested in translating these different apps that we're building to Spanish and other languages you might be familiar with, as well as things like curriculum developments. We're actively working with schools and teachers across the world to integrate satellite imagery analysis into biology and earth systems classes across the world. So if you're interested in seeing how you can potentially integrate satellite imagery analysis into your local classrooms, then definitely reach out about that, as well as potentially giving trainings or workshops, hopefully in person once COVID-19 is over, but for now online to different conferences and schools. We have a set of potential stipend supported or also volunteer positions that are relatively low commitments that we could potentially offer. So I really encourage you to contact me either with your resume or really without, just to inquire about these different positions and see if you're interested in collaborating, because we would really love to have you. And with that, I would love to turn it over to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm really impressed, and it's a really inspiring session. And I'm really impressed about all your work since a young age, and a big congratulations from all of us, and also our best wishes for you and your team, because you're doing an amazing job. And based on this, now we can get started with the Q's and A's. And we have a couple of questions. So the first question is related on how did you get started with your earth science and coding journey? Like what inspired you, and which tips can you share with us to advance that fast?
Sure, that's a great question. So my love in environmental science actually started when I was really young, when I was in primary school. And so our teachers would take us on these trips to a local water body called the Chesapeake Bay, which is right near Washington, D.C. And when we would go on these field trips, we would see the extreme impacts of local pollution on the waterways and how it was impacting all the different ecosystems and the animals around the bay. And so I realized I really loved environmental science, and I loved seeing the interaction between how humans and different ecosystems was changing over time. And so when I was in middle school, when I was in, I think, maybe age 12 or 11 or 12, I started doing a science project in my backyard. I wanted to see what impact climate change would have on the carbon dioxide exchanges of these saplings that my parents let me plant. And so I ran this experiment for a couple of years, and I entered it into a local science competition. And at the competition, there happened to be a judge who worked for NASA. And that judge didn't really know that 14-year-olds were not supposed to work for NASA, but he kind of made some exceptions. And I was able to start working with my current lab at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, and I have been since. And so I actually entered NASA not really even knowing what a satellite was. I've worked with mangrove ecosystems, which are a particular kind of tropical forest over the last couple of years. When I started, I didn't know what a mangrove was. So I think all of this is to say, really my advice is, regardless of your experience in a field, don't be afraid to just kind of jump in and go for it. Because ultimately, if you love something enough, if you're passionate enough about a field, then who's to say you can't do whatever you want with it? If I can go from not knowing what a satellite was to doing all of these analyses, then you can really do whatever you set your mind to in terms of this field if you're interested. And I guess kind of the last point that I would make, I'm really lucky to be involved with a network of really incredible scientists and collaborators who have really supported me through my own work over the last couple of years. So I think as you're developing your passion, the more you can find those mentors or those people in your life who really support what you're doing, regardless of what it is, I think the higher the chances are that you'll ultimately succeed.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your response. And actually, this brings like a really interesting point, because we're living now in a really privileged area with, if you have an internet, just as you mentioned, if we have internet connection and a web browser, we can do amazing things. We can get access to a lot of resources. And based on this, in 2008, Landsat open sourced their satellite imagery services. Mm-hmm. Before this, we had to pay for every image that we were using and processing. So with this said, how do you think the open source code and the advances in cloud computing and digital technologies is in a certain way democratizing the access to space technology and the spread of the impact in human lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's really incredible how much the availability of open source satellite imagery now has opened up the field of remote sensing past what it used to be. It used to be really just confined to well-resourced college institutions, different governmental institutions. But now, even if you're a student in high school across the world, you're able to actually access that satellite imagery for yourself. And I think really that should be the goal of satellite imagery in the first place. It's to help people around the world get a better bird's eye view of environmental changes that people are seeing. And so for satellite imagery just to be restricted to those well-resourced institutions is inherently not democratic, because anyone in the world should be able to see how their planet is changing and how they're impacting it. So I think through open source technology and through tools like Google Earth Engine, which are also open source, the whole field has really opened up a whole new era of people who are now able to analyze things for themselves, which in turn benefits the scientific community as well, because the more people who are working on analyzing these issues, the more groundbreaking results we're ultimately going to get.
Well, thank you so much. And I think Jorge also have a question or a comment based on this. So welcome, Jorge.
Thank you very much, Leandro. Thank you very much, Liza. This is a very interesting and a lot of information that you provide us in this opportunity. And I just want to remark two things. One is this invitation to young researchers to join a common initiatives with, I understand, with a big group of students in US and in other countries. That is very important for us, and we're going to share this possibility with all the group that we have in Central America. And the second and the last point that I have is, as you know, one of the richness of the Central American region for his position between two oceans and the volcanic plate, the geological plates, and etc., is the most important richness that we have is our natural and the biodiversity contents in the region. Maybe we could start to think joint initiative between students in US and students in Central America to monitoring this biodiversity in the region, because we are losing as fastly all this richness. And we're gonna be in touch. I have to leave to another meeting immediately, But thank you very much again in the name of the General Secretary of SICA, and you stay in hands with Leandro Camacho, and we're going to be in touch. Thank you very much, Liza.
Sounds great, and that sounds great. I'll definitely be in touch.
Thank you so much, Jorge. Yeah, so going back, I think we were talking about the open source opportunities and all these new era that we're living now. So, and also complementing with Jorge's point, I think that your work with Space Scope, it's really similar in a certain way in what we are doing in the space apps community, that it's also the NASA competitions around the world. So we host this year in San Jose, Costa Rica. And what we have done is that we translate for the Spanish speaking language, the NASA open source code repository of satellite imagery. So how do you think this could positively impact our Central America and our Central American communities? And also, it will be also a great opportunity to exchange some of these resources with the Space Scope, with the Space Scope team, and maybe start some collaboration, because we're really working in similar areas.
Yeah, I think that definitely sounds great, and that's exactly where we're looking to go with the whole Space Scope project. I think ultimately the fact that all of the apps are currently in English is really limiting in terms of the population of students and the public that we're actually able to reach. And especially if the goal is to really democratize this whole industry of remote sensing, then they can't just be in English. We have to expand to especially Spanish, just because the Spanish speaking world is continually growing, and it's a whole population of students who we really are interested in reaching out to. So I think definitely collaborating with the future with native Spanish speakers throughout Latin America would be a really great opportunity to both hear their perspectives in terms of how they think the app should be tailored to local interests, and also just generally expand our audience for the apps across schools. So definitely I would love to collaborate with that.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Liza. And I think we're getting to the end of this session. So I don't know if anyone in the chat has another question, you can post it on the chat. And if not, we can keep on going with a couple of questions more that we have. And one is, okay, so you were like, since you're 14 years old, you have been like starting all these research about different aspects of earth science. So can you let us know, like, if your learning curve was really hard, or the same things that you were mentioning, like, oh, we have many resources available, these help you to get started faster, or do you have like a long learning curve?
I would say that all of those resources really were amazing in helping me get started fairly quickly. I think when I was starting, I guess that was 4 years ago, many of those resources were actually not available because Earth Engine had really just started to pick up momentum. So I think I had, my learning curve was fairly short just because of the time that I was putting into it. But I think now it's just a completely different world in terms of what's actually available to different students. And so I think just for an example of how small the learning curve is now, I took an intern over the summer to work on the Space Scope project with me. He was a fellow high school student. He had never coded anything in his whole life. And within about 2 weeks, he was able to start actually building fully fledged Earth Engine apps and actually analyzing the satellite imagery for himself. And so that's just kind of testament to the fact that the resources now are robust enough so that even if you've never coded before, don't really even know what a satellite is, then it's pretty easy to get started now, which is really amazing.
That's great, Liza. And also, like this could be a great opportunity for us that we're hosting this event with SICA, the General Secretary from SICA and from your research center. This could be a great opportunity to start some collaboration, to provide some resources, some online sessions, some workshops that can help others to get started, and also to like get into this new field and this new era. So thank you so much, Liza. And finally, can you please give us some inspiring words to all the participants that are in this session?
Sure. So I think in terms of inspiring words, I think the whole world is living in a really tough time right now. In the US, we're about to see whether we can finally change administrations. On the presidential side, COVID is still kind of ravaging the world. But I think if we've seen anything out of this whole crisis, is that people are really committed still to making a difference in the world in terms of climate change and other humanitarian issues that we're continuing to see. So I think it's really important as you look at the news and get kind of increasingly weighed down by everything that's going on to still have hope that we do have a network of researchers and people committed across the world to solving all of these problems. And this will end. We will eventually see an end to the crisis.
Thank you so much, Liza. And hopefully we can keep the collaborations. We're going to work so hard to keep translating all these documentations, to keep opening the access to all these new technologies. And this historical moment. Since 2008, they Landsat open sourced their satellite imagery, and from this point, it has like a complete new shift on the way that satellite imagery is evolving. So this is a great opportunity for all the Central Americans and all the young scientists, students in the world to get started. So we hope that we can keep the collaboration with you, with your program. All the best wishes for your team. You're doing an amazing job. And thanks for SICA for hosting this session of SICA in Space. And hope to see you all in the next sessions, and hope to see soon, Liza. Thank you so much to everyone.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Bueno, le agradecemos nuevamente a todas las personas que nos acompañaron el día de hoy con la sesión de Liza Goldberg. Esta sesión la van a poder ver en el canal oficial de el SICA. Agradecerle a Orlando, a don Jorge y a todas las personas de el SICA y a todas las personas que participaron.